Hello and welcome to this special conversation with the Minister of State for Finance, Mr. Jayant Sinha. Mr. Sinha, thank you very much for joining us. First, Mr. Sinha, a question which the markets want answered. You know, the general anti-avoidance rules, the GAR, which will kick off April 2017, make it very clear that derivatives won't be taxed. But the cash leg, it's always a sell cash, buy futures, or a buy cash, sell futures. That cash leg tends to get taxed capital gains. That will make nonsense of the entire derivative trade. So have you all applied your mind to that? Will, these kinds of trades be excused from capital gains?
You might want to just take a step back. The reality is that all across the world, whether it is the G20, OECD, the United Nations, everybody is trying to get to a much more efficient and effective tax regime. And the whole idea of GAR is to be able to look through certain arrangements which have been done and set up primarily to avoid paying taxes. We can't have a world where people are not paying taxes, so everybody has to pay their fair share of taxes. And so if there are constructs that are set up without necessarily a legitimate commercial purpose, but simply to avoid paying taxes in jurisdictions, then of course we have to ensure that we close those loopholes, and that's what GAR is intended to do. Now, as we bring in GAR, and of course because of the unique nature, of course, I have been an investor in India also, and used many of these provisions myself. So we have to be very careful that as we introduce this new regime, that it's done in a way that is A, predictable, and B, not too difficult from a compliance point of view. So that's why we have said we are going to be able to grandfather it. We are going to provide a time for the transition to work out. And during this time, while the transition is being worked out, we are doing intensive consultations with all stakeholders so we can work through these exact details as to how one leg is going to be taxed and the other leg is going to be taxed. So we are in the process of collecting a number of such situations from various stakeholders, and then we will, as the Revenue Secretary has said, publish them, make them available for everybody, and refine them as we go along.
So as you see, you've been an investor globally and in India, and in every place, the foreign investor, or in most places, except perhaps Argentina, the foreign investor is not taxed in the destination country. He gets income which he takes back home, and he's taxed as income tax in the host country, in the country of his residence. Now, if we start taxing long-term or short-term investors who come into India, we are kind of standing out from the crowd, which may be negative for us.
No, you bring up a very interesting point, Latha, and this actually is a very, very serious matter of how taxation works across the world. I myself have been in a series of important discussions at the UN level, at the G20 level, where we are thinking about the way taxes work around the world. You see, you can either tax at source or tax at destination, which is what you're saying. Right now, by and large, the taxation has largely been at destination rather than at source. We in India have generally tended to follow this taxation at source principle, because if we don't follow that, then what is going to happen is that everybody is going to set up offshore entities. All assets in India are going to be owned offshore, and there will be no capital gains, for example, that we can ever have. This is a problem of indirect transfer that the G20 and the OECD are discussing. There is also global inequity that is caused because of this, because you see what happens is that if all the assets are held in the OECD, the North countries, there are no assets that are held in the South countries, then a lot of tax revenue leaves the countries in the South and goes to the countries in the North, because that's where the assets are. If you tax assets only at destination, not at source, and most of the assets are in the North, then the taxes will only be in the North and there'll be too few taxes in the South. Now, of course, India is one of the very few countries that has the ability to say, look, the current regime that we have right now is inherently inequitable if you set it up between destination and source that way. And essentially, if we continue with this regime, you're going to end up in a situation where all assets in the South are going to be held in the North, right? And all the tax revenue will be there as well. So this is a very serious matter, as I said, that's being discussed at the OECD, G20, UN level, because we have to move to a more equitable tax regime globally. These are all aspects of that, and as I said, we are going to move towards, people recognize the situation, and they recognize that this is where it's headed. I mean, it's not just India, the United Kingdom, the US, everybody is thinking about how to deal with these kinds of issues. And so yes, in that sense, we are an outlier, but we are an outlier for a very good principle, and we are protecting the interests of the Indian public and Indian taxpayers, which I'm sure all of your viewers will appreciate.
I'll be very happy if the government gets more money. I know two ways about that. But being an outlier can also mean that we will scare away investors. That's my big worry. Do we have that much of a punch that we can be such outliers that we will tax and others don't tax?
No, so I think
so. And we also have STT. So in a way, it's not as if we are not taxing them.
No, I agree with you. And that is precisely why we are saying that we have to enter into these discussions. We have to understand what's the right way, in a revenue neutral way or in a revenue enhancing way, to move forward. How do we ensure that we are not just an outlier? How do we get the support of the global community for a more equitable tax regime? These are all matters that are in play right now, and they have to be sorted out. But I think hopefully everybody will appreciate that this is being done in the national interest. It's being done so that we protect not just India's interests, but the interests of other countries in the South also. And so we are working through all that.
Let me now come to my favorite subject. Congratulations, the bankruptcy code has been, law has been passed. That's very good news for the country as a whole and its macros. But how soon will it be implemented? When can we get the first set of tribunals appointed and the first set of insolvency professionals registered?
No, within the next 12 months, we want the bankruptcy system to be operating. And the bankruptcy system will be effective if we are able to move 2 or 3 situations through the bankruptcy process and demonstrate that it works, that the insolvency process is effective, that we can do things in a timely fashion, that there's a efficient and effective recovery, and whether it is workmen or creditors get what is owed to them. So we have to really make sure that we can demonstrate through 2 or 3 cases. Latha, I've done a lot of work. I've done a lot of work in the United States in special situations, distress investing. Yes, of course, we go through bankruptcy processes there, but it is actually the threat of bankruptcy that is in some ways far more important than bankruptcy itself. So the point of getting the bankruptcy system established in India is if we can run through 2 or 3 cases in that fashion, then the fear of hanging concentrates the mind wonderfully. And so the fear of bankruptcy, I think, will enable us to do a lot of preemptive work, because creditor rights are going to be so significantly strengthened as a result of that. So we have to absolutely get it to work for 2 or 3 cases. But I think the far more salutary effect of bankruptcy is going to be when we know that it is going to be possible to invoke it.
If you can give me a timeline, will the first NCLT tribunal take up a case in 6 months, in 3 months? What is the timeline you're looking at?
We have to obviously build capacity as we go along, and so we've said, and I said in Parliament as well, that we think that the implementation process will be staged. As we have the capacity in place, obviously we'll notify it and make it law. So that's how we are thinking about it, but really our sense is over the next 12 months, we'll have a functioning bankruptcy system.
I'll tell you where my skepticism comes for. I was around as a cub reporter in 1993 when the Debt Recovery Tribunal Act was passed and the debt recovery tribunals were set up. I was around in 2002-03 when the Sarfacy Act was passed. And definitely in 2003, since I was in a more editorial position, I went to town saying that, banks will be able to recover assets quickly. Nothing much happened. And I can tell you, as we speak, 4 debt recovery appellate tribunal seats are lying vacant, not appointed. 40,000 cases lying in front of the DRTs. Will that be the fate of the NCLTs?
Well, obviously, we are strengthening capacity in the DRTs. There is a DRT Sarfacy amendment bill that has already been tabled. Yes. Hopefully, we will pass it in the monsoon session. There are certainly some deficiencies as far as DRT and Sarfacy are concerned, and we have to address those. We'll see some of that in the NCLT also when it gets set up.
Tribunals are not registered, they are part executive.
But that's right. So we can have different types of people appointed on the NCLT. So we'll have to see. I mean, the challenge in everything in India, and you can bring this up on almost any issue you want, Latha, is execution.
Let me come to the capitalization of banks. As of December 31, one was prepared for whatever, 5 to 6% gross NPAs from the public sector banks. But now it is definitely 10%. Don't you have to rework your capital numbers? Will 25,000 suffice? Would you not have to set aside more money?
We've worked through the numbers very carefully, Latha. I myself have run the spreadsheets on this, so I've gone through the numbers very carefully. Obviously, we have been working very closely with RBI. We need to really understand what the system-wide asset quality situation is, and we need to do the stress tests. In fact, when I was on the Standing Committee on Finance before I became Minister of State, we had already discussed at that time through a number of meetings that we needed to stress test our banking system, which is precisely what we did with the RBI, starting from about August of 2015 right up till December, January of 2015. And when RBI finished all of that, we had a very good sense across the top accounts, top 200, 300 accounts, what the system-wide stressed assets number were, what the gross NPAs were. So none of this is a surprise to us. Trust us. We are working through the numbers. We know exactly where the banks are with respect to their NPAs, what their capital requirements are, and where they are in terms of the capital adequacy norms. And those discussions are ongoing. The other thing which people lose sight of, but you have to remember that we've also now begun the third phase post the asset quality review, which is the consolidation phase. And you saw that starting yesterday. And through the consolidation phase, through the cost rationalization and so on, we will be able to further strengthen the capital base of our banks as well.
All right, hold that thought, Mr. Sinha. I have to take a mandatory break, but I'm back with more questions.